Hi, Silvana. We just started the webinar, waiting for people to come in now. So we'll be in touch soon, but it's nice to see you. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me good?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Welcome to you that have already joined. I'm just going to give a couple minutes just to let everyone else get logged in and get started. Okay, everyone, welcome. You can see we've got a healthy number already in attendance, and I'm sure a few more are still joining us, but I'd like to say thank you to all for joining us today. My name is Lewis Jones. I'm a senior lecturer here at Loughborough University and chairing our webinar today on photovoltaics and circular economy. We have a range of speakers. We've got 6 presentations and 7 speakers to take us through a whole variety of different topics on photovoltaics, and we're in particular looking at different recycling technologies, but all of this related to the circular economy. So there's a few notices and information I wanted to give out before we get started, and first of which is to promote the Super Solar Hub and network. If you aren't already a member, I'd really like to encourage people to join. The network and hub is around 750 members at the moment. It's a really good mix of academics and students, industrial and policymakers, and basically everyone, all different stakeholders that could be involved in everything related to photovoltaics. And we send out regular emails, newsletters, updates, networking events, things like that. Events like this, different webinars, and so it's really good network to join. Please follow us on social media below at Super Solar Hub, or find us on LinkedIn. Really easy to join up. Just go onto the website button and request to join. It's easy as that. And the other things we wanted to really make people aware of in running webinars and different events, both in person and online, and lots of different free events to join and sign up to. But I also wanted to make people aware that there is a childcare fund that goes along with this. This is really here intended to assist anyone in sort of students, research people, investigators, anyone who's working at other universities or be looking to attend any of the super solar events or sponsored events, and will contribute up to £500 towards additional childcare costs to try and help you be able to attend these types of events. There's a few terms and conditions and stuff like that on the website to look at, but it should be relatively easy to find out more. Please just get in touch if this is something you're interested in or could help you be able to attend any of our events. I also wanted to point out PV Sat 17 and Super Solar Conference. So 26th, 28th of June, hosted by the Institute of Physics in London, so OP event. Full programs there to unlock. So a large conference all about photovoltaics, and registration is still available. So please, at the time, go and look at the event and sign up and register. So the session today, as I said, we've got a range of talks. Each presentation is hopefully going to be about 20 minutes in length, with time for questions and answers at the end of each of these sessions. What I'd like to ask is everyone in attendance, if you can please use the Q&A function within Zoom, and you should have to click the little Q&A button at the bottom and type in any of your questions you may have. And there'll be time at the end of each of the presentations where we'll get responses. We'll read out the questions and get responses back, and also it allows the panelists to continue responding to questions after their topic as well. So please type in any questions you'd have into the box, and we'll be able to hopefully get all your answers and make contact. So without anything else to delay us, I'd like to get us started with our first speaker, which is Dr. Patrick Isherwood from Loughborough University. So I'll ask him to, as I sort of stop sharing, he's going to start sharing. Ask him to share his screen. He's going to be giving a presentation on reshaping the module, the path to comprehensive photovoltaic panel recycling. Over to you, Patrick.
Okay. First of all, just to make sure that's hopefully still visible. Yeah, perfect. Grand stuff. Thank you very much, Lewis. And yeah, thank you for the introduction. So as Lewis just said, I'm Patrick Isherwood. So I'm a lecturer at CREST, Centre for Renewable Energy Systems Technology at Loughborough University. So my talk today is on reshaping the module. So it's the path to comprehensive photovoltaic panel recycling. Basically, the idea with this is very much that it's a relatively high-level overview. I'm certainly hoping that some of the other talks this afternoon are actually going to go into a little bit more detail. But my aim with this is to give a sort of relatively broad overview of kind of where we are with PV recycling. And some of what I see, at least, as some of the kind of issues and the direction that things need to go a little bit of the kind of potential research areas, and some of the sort of aspects I think which definitely need a bit for sort of further work as this becomes more and more of a problem and more of an issue in the years to come. Oh, there we go. Okay, so just a very quick overview, kind of outline of my talk. I'll give a very kind of whistle-stop introduction. Hopefully that will very much be sort of a kind of review really for everybody here. It's hopefully something which everyone's reasonably aware with already. I'll then discuss a little bit about why PV module problem, why we need to consider the recycling of PV modules, discuss a little bit about some of the actual recycling processes themselves, and some of the ideas about some of the different things that we can extract from the modules. A little bit more in detail then about the polymeric materials, some conclusions and some ideas for kind of where we go next. Okay, so just a very quick overview of photovoltaics, kind of a bit of an introduction. Well, what are they? Hopefully this is pretty obvious and everyone here already knows this. Well, basically primarily silicon based devices, but also some cadmium telluride, some copper indium gallium diselenide, some newer materials such as organometal halide perovskites, and one or two other bits and pieces as well, various other kind of bits of technologies, a lot of which is still very much at the kind of research stage. But silicon is very much the primary technology in use today. But the key thing really is that by and large anyway, photovoltaic devices and the panels that are made using them, they're broadly speaking semiconductor-based devices, which are used for the direct conversion of light into electrical energy. And as I kind of mentioned before, the primary technology in use is the silicon device, silicon cell. So that's this kind of thing. This is obviously a research mini module, if you like, although, I mean, it's only one cell, so I'm not sure if that really counts as a module, but it's fully laminated and so on as well. So this is very much kind of what we're talking about. It's this sort of setup. I mentioned CAD-TEL before, and hopefully we'll have a bit more detail on CAD-TEL recycling later as well. This is just for kind of comparison. This is a research CAD-TEL device made at Crest. But it's these guys, as I say, that I will mostly be talking about, the silicon modules. So they cover about 90%, 92%, something like that of the current panel market. Okay, so well, why do we really need to think about recycling photovoltaic modules? Why is this an issue? Well, first of all, the installed capacity of photovoltaics in general has been increasing approximately exponentially for about a decade, maybe a bit more at this point, which is a really positive thing. That's great from an electricity generation perspective, but it does create a certain amount of problems in terms of the waste production or the waste, the end of life issue with PV modules. So broadly speaking, modules tend to have a stated lifetime between 20 and 30 years. It's usually about 25 years is the kind of industry standard. What this means then is that the number of modules which will be coming offline will also increase exponentially or approximately exponentially within the next decade or so. That means that we're going to end up with an exponentially increasing number of waste modules or kind of end of life modules, let's put it that way, as we move forwards. Whatever we do with them, these end of life modules, it's almost always going to be relatively complex, quite kind of challenging thing to deal with. And if we're not careful, we run the risk of it really becoming quite expensive, quite an expensive problem. And on top of that, you've then got other issues such as the fact that they contain some really quite useful, relatively rare materials. And there's quite a significant embodied energy in a PV module as well, all of which is worth trying to recover as much of as possible in some form. Really what we're trying to get to here is that it's worth trying to come up with a sensible set of economic solutions, an economic way of dealing with this now, whilst we still have time to figure out what to do as this problem increases, as we get this exponential increase in modules coming offline. And there's a whole bunch of different potential problems. I'm not necessarily going to discuss all of this now, but things like module removal, transportation, where do we put the sites that we recycle these things, for instance? That's a fairly major problem. Do we have a single site in, I don't know, where would you traditionally, where have we traditionally as a, where has humanity traditionally put recycling or waste facilities? Well, quite often we put them in third world countries that basically don't necessarily get dealt with properly. That can be a major problem. Transport, if you're doing that, some central site transportation is then a major problem. Probably makes more sense to have smaller facilities in each country where you've got less transportation. So there's a whole range of problems like that. I'm not necessarily going to go into that, but there's a huge number of problems of that type as well. And then what do you do with them when you've got them to that location? Well, do you recycle them? Hopefully, yes. Reuse them, potentially, if that's something you can do. Landfill? Well, ideally not. Landfill is very much what we're trying to avoid. Okay, so as I said, I'm very much focusing on silicon in this particular presentation. So why do we use silicon? Well, it's quite good in many ways. It's the second most abundant material in the Earth's crust, oxygen being the only thing which is more abundant. So it's not a rare material. However, it does take quite a lot of energy to refine, and it's typically produced from silicon dioxide using carbon. And I believe it's traditionally at least been coal that gets used to reduce the silicon dioxide to silicon. So it's not exactly carbon neutral to produce in that sense. There may be other ways of doing it, but this is how it's traditionally been or typically been done. Having done that, that produces what's known as metallurgical grade silicon. So that then needs further purification to produce solar grade, the very high purity silicon that's actually used for the production of solar cells themselves. So, and that is a very energy intensive process as well. And as I mentioned before, there are then alternatives, particularly CAD-TEL and CIGS. They're the two kind of traditional alternatives. And increasingly, you'll probably hear about these organometal halide perovskite materials. That's a relatively new material that people are still working with. There are people working on the commercialization of it, although it's not totally got to that stage yet. But it's probably also something that will be worth thinking about from a recycling perspective. Of these, though, for the moment at least, CAD-TEL is very much the more commercially viable alternative to silicon. Okay, so some of that might come across as a little bit negative, but I guess the key thing really, and key kind of fairly positive takeaway from this is that for the most part, at least, the recycling issue when it comes to PV modules is very much economic and not technological. So by and large, we have a whole bunch of different technologies that we can use to recycle most of the materials in a PV panel. So that's really quite a positive thing. What do we mean by that? Well, all of the glass, metal, silicon components, all of that sort of thing, they can, at least in theory, be fully recycled and then reused in effect infinitely. None of those are degraded particularly by the recycling process in and of themselves. You still end up with the same elements at the end. It doesn't, however, mean that they are recycled, unfortunately. So very much the kind of state of the art, and this is starting to change, which is really, really good. But for the moment, at least, very much the state of the art is that, or kind of the way it's often done anyway, let's put it that way. We tend to recycle the aluminium frames and the copper from the junction boxes on the back of the panel. And apart from that, everything else quite often just gets crushed, and you end up with this sort of contaminated glass that gets used as something like a building filler material or for similar sorts of things, which is really quite a waste because there's a lot of really good stuff in there. As I say, that is starting to change. There have been some really interesting developments recently on the continent, particularly France, Belgium, and Germany have done some really, or seem to be making some really interesting moves, and also some really promising noises in the UK and the US as well. So hopefully that is very much changing, and we are starting to get to the point where people are really starting to work on the proper recycling of these materials and the actual extraction of the useful parts. I should also say there's a fairly major elephant in the room. And that is that all modules, at the moment at least, contain some sort of polymeric material, some kind of plastic, and they're not really recyclable, or at least not properly recyclable in the way you might think of them. Certainly not the kind of cradle-to-cradle recycling that you might look for. So just to recap, and hopefully again, this is kind of basic revision for most people here. This is a sort of exploded view of the primary components in your typical module. So you tend to have a kind of glass cover plate, which is also kind of partly a structural member as well. You've got your, assuming this is a silicon module, you've got your silicon cells, which are then kind of strung together using metal interconnects, tapping strip typically. This is all then held together using an encapsulant, which is essentially a kind of adhesive. That's effectively what holds the entire module together. You've then got some kind of protective polymer backsheet, and then the whole lot is held in place by an aluminium frame. You typically also then have some kind of a junction box on the back, which is basically the point where you can extract the current from the device. And essentially, that gives you a thing a bit like this. little cell I showed at the start. So this is very much the same thing. It's just it's only got one cell instead of half a dozen or however many. So when it comes to recycling these things, then you can kind of split the different processes up into two kind of general types, if you like. We've got delamination processes, where essentially what you're trying to do is separate the module with as little damage to the internal components as possible. Or you've got crushing processes where you don't really care. You just smash the whole thing up and separate it out later. It's worth noting that there are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. On balance, I think the crushing processes are probably likely to be more useful in the long run, partly because they're largely, I suspect, easier to automate. And it doesn't necessarily matter about things like what the technology, again, assuming silicon, what the silicon technology is you're dealing with. If you're doing a delamination process, there's all kinds of different things you might need to consider, and an awful lot of it ends up being a sort of manual process as well. Component separation, that is theoretically easier if it's a delamination process. If you're delaminating the thing, there are two different ways of delaminating a module. Typically, you can do some sort of a thermal process, a pyrolytic process, where you burn off the polymers, or otherwise sort of destroy them and evaporate them in some way. Once you've done that, you can then separate out, you can kind of physically pick off the wafers and take everything apart that way. Otherwise, if you're doing something like a crushing process, you tend to have to use some sort of density separation system, so froth flotation or a dry separation process. Those are a bit more complicated, but actually they're fairly well understood. They're things that the mining industry have been using for a very long time for ore extraction and ore concentration. So actually, we know how to do that. We're pretty good at that. I already mentioned a certain amount of manual versus automated processing. This is something which is very much quite a kind of important thing to consider, because obviously it will determine things like labor costs and so on, and also to some extent how fast you can run the process. And then of course there's things like environmental concerns. So particularly with some of the pyrolytic processes, waste gases are a major problem. A lot of the backsheet polymers they're typically fluorinated, so you can end up with fluorinated waste gas, which is an environmental pollutant. A lot of the processes also use some fairly nasty solvents and some pretty unpleasant chemicals, things like nitric acids, hydrochloric acids, and so on. So that's not necessarily a problem, but it does mean that you need to be quite careful about what you do with that, and then what you do with the waste materials or the solvents and the chemicals once you've used them. What do you do with them? Where do you send them? There are waste streams for dealing with that, so we can make use of that, but it's definitely something that's important to think about. Okay, so moving on then quickly, just very aware of the time, to what exactly it is we can extract from a module. Well, the key things really, there's three kind of key expensive parts in a module, a silicon module, if you think about it. Silver. It's actually a fairly minor component of a module, but in terms of cost, it's one of the, or in terms of value, perhaps I should say, it's one of the higher value aspects of a module is the silver bus bars, which are usually screen printed onto the top. Copper tabbing strip, again, copper is quite a valuable material. So extracting the copper is a good idea from that point of view. It's quite economically valuable. And then the silicon, it's sometimes said, or quite often said really, that the silicon is actually the most valuable part, or the most expensive part of any module. Even though silicon is perhaps relatively common and relatively cheap material in other respects. So just kind of going over those different parts, you've got the silver bus bars, the kind of thin wires that's screen printed onto the top of the cell. You've got the silicon, which is the kind of blue colored wafer underneath, and then the tabbing strip, which is actually copper. It doesn't look like it, but that's because it has a solder. It's pre-soldered, so it has a solder layer over the top. It's worth noting as well that the proportion of silver and copper in a typical module is actually really quite considerably higher than most commercial ores for these two materials. So actually extracting the silver and the copper from the module should be economically viable, and it should actually really help with the economy of the recycling process, in theory. And while silicon is definitely abundant, its extraction from old modules should, in theory at least, reduce the energy required for the production of new silicon. So again, in theory, there should be some kind of a saving there. That isn't to say that there is necessarily, but in theory there should be, or there could be. You will, however, initially at least, only be able to extract metallurgical grade silicon, so the lower grade material, which will then need some sort of purification to get back up to the solar grade material required to produce new devices. But at least it's something, it's some way there. We've also then, as I've already mentioned, some of these, there are a number of methods for the separation of the different materials, the different components. So we've got density separation, which can be automated, can be a wet process, dry process. There's a number of different ways of doing that. There's then manual separation processes. Typically, they would be used with a delamination process rather than a kind of crushing process. And there are various different kind of automated processes as well. Some of those things can be automated, they might not be able to be, or it might be easier to. It depends very much on what exactly it is you're trying to do, but automation tends to be quite a good way of increasing the rate with which you can do things and kind of making things a bit cheaper. As I say, the silicon, once you've got it, is then metallurgical grade. It does still require refining to get back up to the kind of true feedstock, the solar grade material. And that's quite expensive. At the moment, at least, my understanding at any rate is that for now, it's still not necessarily economically feasible to get back to solar grade silicon during the recycling and recovery process. But that could potentially be resolved if we could find a cheaper means for processing silicon. That might be a big ask. It's quite a difficult thing to achieve, certainly, but there may be ways of doing that. Silicon is typically refined using a thing called the Siemens process. So this is quite a complicated process. It involves very high temperature deposition of silicon from silane gas. So it's a energy intensive, quite complex and relatively dangerous process. It's not an easy thing to be doing. Okay, so moving on to the polymers and the polymer elephant. So the key thing here really is that all current modules contain polymers in some form. In particular, the majority of modules, although not all, most of them have some sort of composite polymer backsheet, usually involves something like Tedlar or some sort of similar material. These are all fluoropolymers. So there's the polymers that contain fluorine. The reason for that is because it repels water quite nicely. They tend to be quite hydrophobic in that sense. So it's a good way of maintaining the integrity of the module itself. Okay, 2 minutes left. Thanks, Lewis. So, and pretty much all modules use EVA, ethylene vinyl acetate, as a binder. That's the kind of the adhesive. So composites, first of all, are quite difficult to recycle because of the different materials they contain. And particularly if they've got several different materials in there, that can make it really quite complicated because you don't necessarily know what's in the module and what isn't. Sorry, in the material and what isn't. And EVA is a copolymer. So the problem with that is it's a blend of two different materials. So what that means is that you get some cross-linking between the two. So that can be a real issue because it means that actually recycling the substance, you can recycle it if it's not cross-linked to some extent. But my understanding of it, at least, is that once it has cross-linked, it becomes really quite difficult to recycle. So this is really quite a serious challenge. It's quite a difficult thing to deal with. And when it comes to recycling, very few, if any, polymers are really truly recycled anyway at the moment. What typically happens is that it's done on a kind of thermal basis. So every time they're recycled, so even the sort of, I don't know, a drinks bottle that you put in your recycling, every time it's recycled, you get some degradation of the material. So ultimately, all you're doing is prolonging its life rather than actually recycling it truly, if that makes sense. You're not doing the kind of cradle to cradle recycling. So that's kind of where we should be aiming for. But that gets a bit difficult with polymers for various reasons. So what can we do about this? Well, in the first instance, not necessarily all that much, unfortunately. The problem with that is that existing modules already contain these materials. That said, there are some really interesting developments in polymer chemistry involving breakdown of polymers into their constituent monomers. So because of that, you should be able to manage actual true cradle-to-cradle recycling because you can break your material into its monomer and then build it back up again. So you don't get that degradation in properties over time. And for future modules, then the design and development of environmentally benign alternatives is going to be key. So something like plant-based polymers, such as starch, for instance, or viscose, something like that, where because it's plant-based, you can recycle it, but if you can't recycle it, you can burn it, because that's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. It's a relatively recent carbon material. It's not a fossil material. Or alternatively, a non-polymeric sealant or adhesive system. Now, this is more complicated. There are examples such as this paper here, but they're quite difficult to achieve, and I'm not really sure how viable that is, but it's definitely worth a look. Okay, so I guess the key kind of takeaway from this is that PV module recycling, refining, upcycling of constituent materials is really important. It's a key area for further research and development. An awful lot of the issues, particularly pretty much everything apart from the polymers, really is economic, not technological. And finding economic means for the production of high-grade materials from end-of-life modules is really, really important. It will mean that we can ensure, so we can get full recycling of the modules, and it will be a competitive alternative to the production of new materials, of virgin materials. But the polymers are still an issue. So just very, very quickly then, my sort of thoughts for the kind of key places to go for the future. Module construction, I think it's really important to try and design modules both for long-term outdoor stability, which we really need, but also for the ease of deconstruction and recycling. It's quite a big ask, but I think it's an important thing to try. And then to develop sensible and fully recyclable alternatives to the polymer materials which we're currently using. So something which is better in that sense, something which we can recycle more readily, or alternatively, which is plant-based. And then finally, more economic grades potentially for upgrading metallurgical silicon to solar grade silicon. That's a big ask, but if we can do that, that would be a really big breakthrough in my opinion. Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Patrick. So we have some questions that have come in. One from Andrew Urquhart, who is asking about silver. He's sort of quoting a BBC article where saying that, silver's going to become a bottleneck to manufacturing some of the new panels in the future. So what other comments do you have on, recovering that valuable material from the panels?
Well, I think it's a really important one to recover, certainly. And I mean, silver is an interesting one. It's not actually hugely rare, but it's not very common either. So, I mean, it's a precious metal for a reason. And it is used. The problem is the problem with it, and the reason it gets used as for the bus bars, is that it's the most, I believe, it's the most conductive single element metal that we have, and it doesn't oxidize very readily. I mean, it does, but it doesn't oxidize that quickly. So it's a really good material from that perspective. It's a really good current collector. So it's, in theory, we could replace it. We could probably use copper as an alternative, or possibly something else, but it's difficult. So there's nothing which is ever going to be quite as good. If we're going to carry on using it, then yeah, absolutely, we need to be recovering this stuff. I think that's fairly key. But I think people will, because the thing there is that because it's expensive, recovering it is likely to improve the economics of the recycling process. So yeah, absolutely. If we can find an alternative, then fabulous. But definitely it's something that needs recycling, and recovery of it and reuse is definitely the way forward, I would say.
Thank you. Another question from one of the panelists. Do you want to ask, or do you want me to read it out?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Patrick, great presentation. Just on your conclusions, you had two competing approaches for modules, because when you want to do a module that's used for long term, you probably want to package it very well against the elements and humidity, etc., right? And that on its part makes it hard to deconstruct and recycle, right? So I guess from your perspective, what is right now more important to prioritize, or what are you hearing?
That's a really good question, a very difficult one to answer, I would say. You're absolutely right. It is they're two very difficult competing needs, I suppose, in terms of module development. My kind of feeling, I'm very much leaning towards this idea that we should be using probably something like a plant-based material for the back sheets and for the adhesive, but something which is very robust and which we could, has the same level of robustness as the materials that we're currently using. But I mean, I don't like the idea of burning something necessarily, but at least if it's plant-based, it doesn't matter as much. Alternatively, finding a non-polymer way of binding the modules together. So you can use a glass module instead of a polymer backsheet. And there are possible options for that, but finding something which doesn't have any carbon in it to do that is really hard. But if we can do that, then again, that would be really, really effective as well. Having a purely inorganic module, I think, would be fabulous, just difficult to achieve. But so that's where I would kind of see that, or that's where I would like to see it going. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'll let us move on to the next speaker. But thank you very much, Patrick. There's a few more questions that have come in the chat that I think you'll be able to respond to. We're asking for a bit more information, so I'm sure you'll get around to that. But thank you for your presentation.
Okay.
Stop sharing, and then we can let Jan take over. So our next presentation is from Jan Klink from PV Cycle, and who's going to show us this presentation titled "State of Play PV Panels in Recycling Europe in WEEE Compliance."
Yes, just right. Yep. Sorry, here am I.
Is everything over to you?
Yep. Thank you, Lewis, for the introduction. I was asked to talk about state of play of PV panels recycling in Europe and WEEE Compliance UK. It might tend a bit more to the compliance part. You will see it in the slides, but I think Patrick already explained a lot about what is a PV panel and what are the options in recycling. But who we are, PV Cycle, we are active for now 16 years, almost 17 years, and we started as a non-for-profit, and we're still non-for-profit association since 2007. And we started as the first voluntary take-back system on the planet. And at that time, there was no, I would say, no extended producer responsibility, as you see there, EPR, abbreviation for this. And this started in 2014. So then we were, as PV panels, put under the scope of the WEEE directive, or the e-waste directive, where also laptops, TV sets, washing machines, hair dryers, and the like are under. So we also had to change ourselves a little bit, and that's why we also have, for example, a PV Cycle UK producers compliance scheme. Matt, one of our team members, is also present in this meeting, but we also have legal entities and organizations in other European countries on the continent, like in Germany or Italy. Since June 2010, we collected so far almost 75,000 tons. This is still a number, 65,000 of end of 2021, but it's already a bit more. If you would convert it into gigawatts, you could convert more or less. It's more or less the same as 1 gigawatt, a bit more now. So at the end, knowing and understanding that there is some 300 gigawatt installed in Europe, the 1 gigawatt who already returns over a time span of 12 years is nothing. PV Cycle as well has established a quality management system since 2015. We are more and more operating on a global level, and we run everything for now with 15 to 16 staff members. And that's what we're doing. On the right side, you see the legal WEEE compliance obligations. So that's what each company which is putting a PV panel on the UK territory or on the French territory or on the Italian territory has to comply with. Okay, the UK is no longer part of the EU, but when they were still part, they also were following this directive. And then the one who is doing that, the company who is doing that, or the national person even, has then to comply with those 7 obligations. And one of them is also organizing the waste management, so the bullet point 4, which you then see more in detail on the left side, which we call the downstream service we provide. So we provide the upstream, more the administrative services regarding the compliance with extended producer responsibility. And we also provide the downstream services, organizing the collection. The things are sent to recycling and treatment facilities, and or reuse. I come back to reuse in a minute. Already highlighted by Patrick, a PV panel. So maybe a weird slide, but I'm always showing it to the PV community in that sense that when a waste guy, when a recycler, a true recycler, I mean, one who is already in business since many years and is only crunching material and waste and again material, he's looking to a PV panel and he says, wow, this is 80% or even more, 90%, or even 95, depending on which technology and so on. But it's a bunch of glass, a lot of flat glass, and a bit of, yes, a bit of ferro and non-ferro metals, whereby aluminium then is taking the hugest or the biggest share, and then followed by a bit of plastics and a bit of other ferro and non-ferro materials. Some are interesting, some are less interesting, and some are economically very interesting, but 5 years later, the same, I would say, valuable materials and metals would be also more a cost factor. So it goes up and down in the recycling world, and that's really an important one to take away after this meeting. But realize this is mainly a glass product, a laminated glass product. I compare it always with a car glass or a building glass. Okay, it looks a little bit different, or a cooking plate in your kitchen, similar thing. So it's just a bit of a laminated flat glass, and there are some extra features on it, but it's a glass product, and it's not an e-waste product. It's not metals and plastics. It's not like your laptop. It's not like your mobile phone. It's not even like a washing machine, which is full of metals. So it's a glass, mainly a glass product. And that's important. But what is also important that the PV panels, and it was tipped off in the question of Silvana to Patrick, yeah, what about, do you want a product which has a long lifetime, which has a product guarantee of 10 years, performance guarantee of 20 years, maybe some feed-in tariffs by some policymakers issued with giving you 15 years or 10 years or whatever, some money from the government? Do you prefer this? And that it prevents for many years waste, that it prevents the product for many years cost for the society? Do you want this as community, as society, or do you really want a mobile phone, Steve Jobs, coming on a stage every year and telling you, I have a new product, throw away the other one and buy a new one? That's also an option where you can stand in, but then you are not really preventing waste. So then you are in the classical economy of producing, manufacturing, and consuming as fast as possible and as generating as fast as possible waste. PV panels are preventing waste for a long time. And when they even become waste, especially the ones which economically have an end of life, the more bigger investment PV power plants, well, most of them, maybe, yes, you can reuse them. Why not? Why not? You can extend even their lifetime. So it might be still extended with 10 years, and then they only become really a waste product, which then, yes, you can throw into the recycling and the recovery and the treatment, and you treat the products with a pre-treatment facility, with a final treatment facility, and so on. But what we now already have in the PV, with PV panels, we are preventing waste. We can reuse PV panels. I leave in the middle if it's legal and illegal, the guys which are still doing it today or doing it today. You can recycle them, you can recover them. The technical part of the whole story, this recycling and recovery item, this is really not the challenge anymore. And this was for me still the surprise after 16 years PV cycle. I come from the waste business, and I thought this was the biggest challenge when I started in 2008 with PV cycle. After 16 years, I have to say, technically, that's really not the issue anymore. The issue is volume. Where is the waste? Where is the volume of waste every day coming into a plant? Do I receive every day 500 tons? Because when you have an industrial scale treatment facility, you do easily 500 tons in a day. You can process 100,000 tons in a year. And that waste is not there. This waste is not there because the product has such a long lifetime. And of course, we avoid disposal and landfilling, at least in most of the countries on this planet. So that's what I said at the end. Yeah, we miss the waste. Where is the waste? It sounds a bit weird, yes, asking for waste. But on the other hand, we have to stress much more as industry that we are preventing waste, that we are preventing cost for the society and for a lot of other items as well. It's what I already explained, but that's here also the question raised by Savannah again. Yeah, is this what we want? Do we want to develop an easy to recycle, an easy to reuse PV panel where maybe with 3 clicks you remove everything, the glass, the junction box and whatsoever, and you can easily touch it and you can easily repair it, you can easily recycle, but then you will have a product with probably a lifetime of 1 year, because a PV panel, once it's sold, it's really living outside. It's not like your mobile phone. It's not sitting in your pockets. It's not like your washing machine, which is protected in-house and so on. No, it immediately lives in temperatures of -20, +20, +40, sun, hail, storm, snow, wind, whatever. So, or do you want really a product which has really a long lifetime, which is generating electricity, which provides electricity for a long period, which is really a good investment product? So that's will be the challenge or the curse. That's up to further discussion. And about reuse, there is a huge potential here as well that PV panels are contributing to an extended lifetime, but we are looking for conditions which at the end of the day, you have a qualitatively and environmentally sound reuse activity. Without guarantee, maybe, okay, why not? But at least then also for the without guarantees, make sure that they have underwent some testing, or you really give them also a guarantee of maybe 1 year product guarantee, 18 months of performance guarantee, and you also provide them with some extras, which you will see in a minute. But that's the main question here as well. PV industry starts to get proud about what you're doing. You're preventing waste, which a lot of your other products on this planet, other products which are under extended producer responsibility, are not doing today. And about reuse, we have done a study in 2020. This is a little bit a summary of the results a little bit, but that's I already explained it a bit. We need some minimal testing requirements besides the visual inspection on PV panels. We need to set also a quantitative criterion on when a potential PV panel, when this PV panel becomes end of use for some persons on this planet, and they maybe after 8 years, then we want to test it. Then at least would be good to have a minimum set that you said, okay, when the PV panel is still generating 70% of its capacity, it's fit for reuse, potential reuse. It still needs to be some extra checks and so on, but at least it's fit for reuse. But when a panel is still generating 20% of its capacity, do we still want this to bring into a reuse channel? Yes or no? And that's what these decisions which has to be taken. In my opinion, not, because a panel which has such a low capacity, that means that it will be very soon waste, or yes, it still may be working a little bit today, but within a week or a month, it's really become rubbish. And if you want to send rubbish and ship rubbish, even legally, complying with all the documents needed, and you want to even ship this legally to another country, but in that country, they do not have recycling and waste management infrastructure, what is then the added value of bringing this into reuse? And if you set up a whole preparation for reuse, well, think about maybe a product warranty of a couple of months or 1 year and a performance guarantee and the like. And also, last point, very important, foresee that it also has a passport, that it has a full identity kit. Do we then know, okay, it was once a panel from brand X, it was once a 300 watt peak panel, it's now still 220 watt peak. This and this has been done. This was the refurbished activities. It has been done in this reuse center by technical skilled people and so on. Get this full track and trace record on a PV panel, just like you buy some other refurbished items with a guarantee and so on, not to mention an iPhone. So, and even if you start to ship reused or panels which are really stamped fit for reuse, then make sure that you ship them to countries where they at least have also a little bit of waste management infrastructure, that they are able to collect it properly at least, or at least that they can do a first treatment properly or whatever, because what we see today in the study is that a lot of these panels are shipped to Sahel countries in Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Palestinian territories, and Turkey. That's the top destinations of currently what is in the business called reused PV panels. Well, then you have to wonder yourself, have all those countries a good waste management infrastructure today, which is at the same level of what we have in some countries in Europe or in other territories of the world? And the answer is no. And of course, what is also very important, that a reuse center, which is really then preparing the panels for a second life, that this reuse center has some clear criteria, clear requirements as well on what has to be in place there. Do they need skilled people or not? Or do they need people who have no clue what AC and DC means? But I think they need, because at the end of the day, it's a product which is generating electricity far more, I would say, challenging than repairing a laptop, which is consuming electricity. So the guarantee I would like as a purchaser, as a buyer of secondhand PV panels, I would like really a true guarantee, and I would like to be 100% certain that I buy something very good, very qualitatively, and that it's properly done, and not something which is just a little bit washed and go, and then it's sold online and whatever, and you have no clue what you're buying. So that's also why PV Cycle, after the study, said, okay, let's try to initiate maybe a standard. And our hope was maybe getting this done on a European level with a bit of an opportunity took place, and we could even bring it to the IC level, the International Electrotechnical Standardization Committee, where in Working Group 82, we put it on the table saying, guys, this is the item, and it would be good to have an international standard that all countries around this globe apply the same thing if the standard would come. We were allowed to start, but we were allowed only to start with a technical report. That's now still ongoing. We are funding the coordinator. Today, more than 30 worldwide experts are sitting in the group and in the discussion, which is great. We hope to deliver this technical report by October this year. And then, of course, the working group has to decide, okay, now based upon the technical report, do we really want a standard or a technical specification about the item reused and reuse of PV panels? And then, yeah, regarding, I would say, the treatment, only a few words. As Patrick mentioned, yes, I heard again, for me, the very annoying word upcycling and downcycling. I do not like it. I do not like it since 16 years, and I will say this until the end of my professional career. I have maybe worked too long in the waste business. That's maybe my challenge. And maybe a lot of people have never seen waste in their life and have never seen how things are done. There is nothing like upcycling and downcycling. There is just recycling, period. And every recycler, everybody who is in this value chain of not only the collection, but really here where the treatment takes place, the first treatment, the final treatment, because the first treatment, somebody removes, for example, if you put it linked to PV panels, you remove an aluminum frame and a cable and a junction box, and maybe then it goes to a next treatment plant, which is more familiar with treating flat glass products and D-light. But everyone in this value chain try to recover as much as they can of the materials. And they also will focus on all the materials which has a value, depending on when there is a value, because sometimes the copper price is very high, but sometimes also the copper price is very low. So it does not mean that when it's low, it's not recovered, but then also it has to be linked again with volume. It makes the challenge of seeing a product, a waste product which contains 500 grams of copper, or a product which contains 5 milligrams of copper. Yeah, you rather focus on the 500 grams, of course. So I would put it like this: all the treatment solutions which are in place are good solutions, and you will all need them. If at one point in time you have to start about processing 300 gigawatts in Europe and maybe 300 gigawatts in North America and maybe a terawatt in Asia and so on, then you need all the solutions. There is no best solution whatsoever. That's impossible. That does not exist in the waste business. Everybody has a spot, and also this waste business will decide how it will work. and you will need first treatment plants, you will need final treatment plants, you will need final treatment plants which are focusing on one specific material, but which are able then to refine it to maybe 5N purity. So I think this is, I would all invite you once, visit waste recyclers, visit waste management companies, and that will already help a lot in the whole discussion. But anyway, once it's all treated, materials are recovered, you have a recovery of material. At the end of the day, this really becomes then, recovery. Then you can really recycle the mono materials, which are glass or maybe which are copper or whatever. But you will always have also materials which are ending up in other material recovery. That's for example, the smelters, and you will have material which is ending up in energy recovery. I'm also seeing that I have to speed up, so I will do this. General speaking, we have an average recycling rate today of 70%. Is this good or bad? I think it's quite good if you compare it to all the products you see here, which are also under EPR in Europe. A lot of them are below the 70%. But as I already mentioned several times, volume, that's the big thing, and that's the big discussion. Do you want very consumable PV panels to put on the market, or really products which have a long lifetime and are an investment? That was maybe our evaluation, but yeah, it has been recently published, our evaluation of having PV panels under the WEEE directive. I will not go into detail. You just see bumping them in, and you see constantly the difference between PV panels and the other electronic equipment of the WEEE directive. And you see that there is true big differences between both products constantly. The one has a stable market, the one has maybe a more volatile market. When somebody decides in eastern part of the world to invade another country, like it happened last year, well, it has immediately an impact on our business and so on. I don't think it has in business on the sales of iPhones, for example. So that was a bit our evaluation of the WEEE directive. I will leave it as it is and do not focus too much on it, because we are running into a final slide, which is a short evaluation about the United Kingdom. I would say the evaluation is a little bit the same. So our message is really, as PV Cycle, after all those years under the WEEE directive, this has never been the proper instrument to manage extended producer responsibility for products which with a very long lifetime, which are investment products. We are pleading for a separate legislation, extended producer responsibility we are not arguing about the EPR, but we really would look forward to something about for all renewable energy equipment and products, and for really putting there also all the products which have really a huge investment potential. Because discussing collection targets for PV panels based upon the sales of the past 3 years, that's completely insane. That's completely insane, because nothing is coming back. So we will never achieve the targets. And in some countries today in Europe, you receive even fines as PV Cycle because you did not reach those collection targets. So that's insanity. But the same, as I said, for evaluation of the WEEE also applies to UK. Also, UK has a little bit of a huge challenge, Lewis and the rest of the engineering community, looking for environmentally sound treatment for PV panels. That's really today a challenge in the UK. And what we also see as PV Cycle is a huge impact of Brexit, more difficult to ship PV panels out of the UK to the continent, where today environmentally sound treatment exists. So that was the end of my presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk. One question that's coming from the audience from Benny Mohammed. In your experience, seeing lots of PV waste or PV panels coming to that end of their normal life, and what's the typical conditions been? Is reusing them, is the majority can be used, or is most of this heading down to different waste streams?
That's really depending on the source. I would say it's very obvious if you have really huge PV power plants, a 5 megawatt, 10 megawatt, 50 megawatt and more. Yeah, of course, then you also have almost a passport. You have immediately an identity kit of what was the performance of the installation, which racks are not working anymore, and so on. You can immediately decide on what to do with it, and to decide also which panels go into the reuse channel and which panels are not. I would say everything what is the household rooftop business, I would forget about it, because that's really small amounts per rooftop, and then they are collected and the amounts are put together, the brands are put together, and the whole micmac. You have no identity card, neither on what was the performance and so on. So that's a little bit in high level an answer on this one.
Thank you. Another question from our panelists.
Yeah, the disassembly process needs to be automated for greater efficiency. Yeah, it's a good question, but it's linked with the item of volume. Ali, put yourselves in the shoes, and already somebody mentioned it. And the waste business and the recycling business is similar like any other businesses. Once you run volumes, then you really will invest in recycling lines which are really becoming automated. So the first guys I ever worked with as Recycle, yeah, well, a lot of things were done manually. But once the volumes are ramping up, yeah, then you of course start to put it on a line where you still maybe need 5 operators, and more volume comes in, then you only need any more 2 operators. And to give you an example, it's a complete different product, but for bottle glass, in the Netherlands is the biggest treatment unit for bottle glass. It's a fully automated line. There is only 1 operator, and he's just watching a whole day to a computer and a screen, and that's it. And he just, from time to time, he says, "Hey, colleagues, there is still somebody on the floor as well." Okay, we have there a bottleneck, really, literally a bottleneck, remove some stuff, but it's possible. But this plant as well receives also daily 10,000 tons are coming in of bottle glass, wine glasses, whatever. Yeah, if you can have this guarantee, then you immediately, a waste business guy will immediately invest in automated lines. But he wants a stable supply, and that's really constantly the discussion. And I hear too much the discussions about we need to achieve 100% recycling and recovery of metals and the like. Yes, this is technically possible, but at what cost? Who is willing then to explain to the one who has to finance this extended producer responsibility that it costs $1,000 per ton or $500 per ton? So it's you have to put it all together, and then you really find a good balance between ecology and economy. But once the volumes are coming in, you will see that it really becomes a run to have the first automated line, but really automated, not what I see today on the market, where people think they have an automated line. And so that's the lines where I see today are promising, but they are still a joke. When the big volumes come in, this is a joke what's currently existing.
Thank you. There's just time for one last question from Silvana.
Yes. So I actually have 2 questions. Hopefully it can be short, but I mean, I've heard this approach a lot of putting the waste or placing the treatment lines of PV in low-income countries, right? But this sounds a little bit like waste or impact shifting. So I don't know, like, how much have you heard on that aspect or thought on that sustainability and human aspect? And the second question was, I guess, a clarification, because I didn't fully understood on your conclusion slide, how the collection target of PV, or what do you mean by the collection target of PV panel ignores the waste generated approach?
But yeah, very simple, Silvana. Okay, Ali, that's typical European WEEE directive. So in the e-waste directive in Europe, they have imposed a collection target of 65% has to be collected in a year, and that has to be 65% of what has been sold in the past 3 years. So you sell something, yeah. So for washing machines and iPhones and Steve Jobs kind of brands, whoa, this is top. Hey, this is top, because these guys are every year go on stage. We have a new product, we have new this, we have new that. We buy it because yeah, that's normal. But 65% of PV panels sold in Germany in 2020.
Yeah, so doesn't track.
You do not track them. So in some countries, not in all. Luckily, some countries are really wise enough in Europe, but some others are not. And then they are stating, okay, the category PV panels, because in some countries it's also linked to per category of EE. The category PV panels did not achieve it, so here is a big fine. So at the end of the day, this extended producer responsibility under we in Europe is not anymore about contributing to the environment. It's about a money machine. It's about it's like banking. It's not anymore about EPR. It's about banking. And this is becoming really insane. And I really would like and plead for, let's talk about windmills, solar thermal, geothermal, solar heat pumps, which are also long-term products. And let's then discuss about the key performance indicators for this kind of products. And let's really put on the table prevention of waste. And then you might have easily also an answer to your question you raised to Patrick, because then you can focus, yes, let's have this sustainable long-term product still on the market. Maybe difficult to crunch it and to dismantle it when it becomes waste. But yeah, what do you want? There are pluses and minuses at both angles. And that's really a key discussion in the next phase of a discussion of a revision of the WEEE directive in Europe.
Thank you very much for that. I think I'm sure you could.
First question I could not answer, Silvana, but I forgot it also.
It's all right. I think there's some more questions in the chat that we can keep answering.
Right.
I want to say thank you very much, Jan, for taking us through that. If you would like to stop sharing, we can let our next speaker get in line. So next we have Peter Stout-Fischbach, and he's going to be teaching us some of the lessons he's learned over 15 years of PV recycling. So thank you very much, Peter, and hopefully over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So is the sharing okay?
Oh, good, thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot for inviting me. I can only agree with most of the points of the two contributors before me, and I feel the pain of Jan. So let's go into it. So first of all, a short overview of our history. So First Solar is currently, I think, the only company globally which produces cadmium telluride thin film modules in real big quantity. So it has a long history, started in the US in the 90s of the last century, and we started production in Germany in 2007 with the Series 2 modules. And this was stopped in 2012 due to some political strange activities in Germany. I think around 2008 or 9, we have been #1 globally with out peak power produced annually. And now we are hardly #10 with 20 times the capacity we had then. So you can see how fast this business grew and still is growing exponentially. Currently, we have our biggest production sites in Malaysia and in Vietnam. And we have a big one in the US, in Ohio, and built another one in Alabama now, and one in India. So we will go to more than 20 gigawatts production power per year, and we will still be small compared to the Chinese silicon guys. So our technology is a little bit simpler than the silicon technology, which also has some significant advantages for recycling. In our case, the old modules really had no aluminum. The new ones, which have much bigger size, have aluminum backframe. And we have glass modules, so no polymer backside. And you can see it consists of a front glass. Then we have a front contact, which needs to be transparent, obviously. And then we have a semiconductor, which is put on the glass in a vacuum process, and it has only a thickness of 3.5 microns. So it's really only 1% of the weight of a comparable silicon module. We need a back contact, obviously, and then we have the lamination material, which has been EVA in the beginning, but I think now we are using polyolefin, which is a little bit simpler for recycling, and especially it makes the whole chemistry of the module more stable, so we can have a better lifetime. So that leads us to our recycling process. You can see here our old series 2, 3, 4 modules, they all had the same size. And they go to a shredder first and then to a hammer mill, where we have then particle sizes of around 4 millimeters. And after that, it goes to a leaching process where we use sulfuric acid and hydrogen peroxide. After that, we can separate the materials to mainly the glass, so which also is around 90% in our case, and the polymer and the semiconductor material, which is then precipitated out of the solution of the sulfuric and hydrogen peroxide. This one goes to refining, to special companies like 5NPV in Canada, and they again produce high purity cadmium telluride, which we use to build new modules. So we have a real recycling process here. For the glass in Germany, we have oops, that's not what I want to do. In Germany, we have a generation first recycling plant where the cleanliness of the glass is not good enough to produce glass products. So that is used to produce insulation material for the construction industry. And the main reason for that is really that the volume is not high enough. The point is that we recycled meanwhile globally more than 200,000 metric tons in 15 years, roughly 100,000 tons in Germany, in Frankfurt, which is tiny compared to what we heard from Jan, because a real economic recycling plant needs that amount of material in 6 months. So we still consider ourselves being a kind of pilot plant, and we do like 10,000 tons a year currently. And that's all which comes from whole Europe. We sold like 1 million tons of modules in Europe, and we expect when the majority reaches the end of life, 20 years or more, we will have a few years around 2030 where we will get back 100,000 tons per year. Yeah, and that is only a tiny part of the whole market. So these are new numbers now, not referring to the weight, but to the value of the material. And you can see here the biggest part value-wise is in fact aluminum and silver from the silicon modules. You see here they also have tellurium and cadmium, but it's just not visible. The amount is so tiny, it's somewhere here below. It never is visible. So the amount is just too little to be of economic interest for the majority of recyclers. So we need to do this ourselves because we need the tellurium. It's comparably rare as a mineral as silver. It just does not have the price because you can do not much with it except building PV panels. And it's only a byproduct of copper and tin mining. So we really need to have the global the global tellurium based for First Solar to achieve that 20 gigawatt production capacity. And that's one of the main reasons why we started recycling so early, because we knew we need the tellurium back. So to have a broader view, I I like to refer to the work of the Club of Rome, which built that famous World 3 model 50 years ago, which has seen a lot of criticism, mainly from the fossil lobbyists. But there are also recent investigations, and they found that the current empirical data is broadly consistent, even with the 1972 projections. And in my opinion, that is frighteningly accurate, and it's really extremely important that we change the whole economic system with respect to material use and use of our environmental resources. So the latest outcome of the Club of Rome working group has defined 5 turnaround actions to mitigate the worst outcomes of the climate crisis. And turnaround 5 is transforming the energy system. And there's one tiny remark, so drive down use of materials. So that's where we come in. So that's one of the standard recycling graphs. And point 1, which is not often mentioned, is we need to think differently in many cases. Then comes the standard reduce. So reduce was also mentioned. You can go the way to produce long life modules. And we see from our old modules, which are running now for 20 years, they are still in good shape. They show better performance than what we guaranteed. And they are good for at least 30 years. And for the new modules we produce, we expect that they have a useful lifetime of more than 40 years. And they are also in the silicon field, there are meanwhile producers who give a guarantee of 30 years. So I think the long life module way is a very important one to pursue, to take the first part, reduce the material. So if we have double the lifetime, we need only half the material. That's quite straightforward. That's the way I would prefer. So in that case, the point 3, repair, refurbish, reuse, might play a minor role, especially for our thin film modules, because they are more or less not repairable. We have nothing in to break, not even the diodes which are used in the junction boxes of the silicon modules. So if our module is broken, it's broken. If it does not produce power, you cannot do much. So, and then of course you come to recycle. And that leads us to the problems and potential solutions. So Jan showed a picture where he had neatly stacked modules on a truck, which looked like they were new. That's not what we see. We mostly get improperly dismantled and significantly soiled modules back. In average, I would say 50% of the modules are broken already. So that is also a problem for automatic handling if you try to do this. The point is that the dismantling is mostly done by cheap manual labor. And as long as the end of life modules do not have a monetary value, I don't see a possibility to change this, at least not for our modules. So we need, in my opinion, we need to put that value into the module by regulations, by CO2 pricing, whatever you can do, what makes sense to get that value into the end of life module. So everybody would be interested to give it back to get some refund. So that would for me be one important step. Currently, with our low throughput per year, the only 10,000 tons, we see high logistic costs. We gather the modules mainly from whole Europe, but sometimes as far as from Samoa in the Pacific. So we see logistic costs of 20 to 50% of the total recycling cost, which is prohibitive. So that's not a model for the future. I put here some links to new approaches. The mobile recycling units are now in a pilot phase from a company called Fluxres in Dresden, and they are able to apply a completely new recycling a process which uses high power light flashes, and they can put the recycling unit into just 2 standard containers. So you can send it somewhere in the world, do the recycling. They can do like 10,000 tons per year with 2 containers. And then you get back a really clean glass. We tested this with our modules already, and I saw it also for the silicon modules. You get very good separation without any chemistry involved. That seems to be a very good approach. But currently, I don't see implementation in Europe because the environmental regulations are so strict. It's nearly impossible to get this running. The next part is the high purity process. So we have that company Rosy in France, and they are able to take that material which comes off the modules and refine it to high purity silicon, which saves one stage of the silicon, that Siemens process, which I think Patrick mentioned. And so this would save a lot of energy. And that also needs to be built into the price of the end of life module, in my opinion. So, but the biggest problem we see is the conflicting laws and fragmented implementation of the base regulations. What Jan already mentioned, it's really incredible. We have 28 member states in the EU, and we have 28 different regulations how to handle the PV waste. And that is for me the most important point, that we have. Finally, we need, in my opinion, a global standardized process of handling that stuff without filling in additional paperwork or electronic forms when we cross some kind of border. You just can't handle this economically. Everybody will try to get around this and throw the modules just somewhere, dump them somewhere. That's for me the hardest point. I have no idea how we can do this. It's already difficult in Germany, not to mention EU, and globally I see no way in the near future. So yeah, that is my points. I provided some additional sources, and I will provide that presentation as a PDF, so you can send this around to the participants. And there is some interesting, deeper insight in the systemic implications of that whole stuff for those who are interested. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I just will hopefully get some more questions coming in. I think a recurring thing across a few of the presentations has been the difference between like the economic value of those materials. You know, you have your figure showing, you know, that the tellurium and cadmium are not really worth it for the money, but can you give us a bit of an idea of what maybe the environmental impacts those might have compared to some of the other materials would be, or why recover the cadmium and can't just be about money?
Yeah. So economically, we would not need the cadmium. The cadmium is also a byproduct of copper mining, and it's available in huge quantities. It's even in every onion and in salad and things like that, and especially in cigarettes. So of course, it's a heavy metal. It's hazardous, and you need to know what you do. We made now the experience, we need to do biomonitoring on our production sites to make sure we always have stable processes to keep that stuff contained. And until now, with now nearly 20 years of experience, we found out that our occupational doctors always could distinguish between smokers and non-smokers, but they never could distinguish between production people and administration people. So it's possible to keep this under control. Of course, compared to real chemical industry, it's still quite easy. Of course, we use that stuff in dozens of tons per year in every fab. So it's not like just a bottle, and you have to have the controls in place. But I think we proved, and also the chemical industry, the material industry in total, proved that it is possible to handle this.
Thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, because I overrun on some of the other ones, I'll say thank you again, Peter, for your presentation, and we'll move over to our next speakers. Which,
Yep.
2 in 1, so double your money. And we got Matthew Royal and Dr. Susanna Iglesias Boris from Newcastle University, and I'll hand over to them, who are going to talk on implementing solar in the UK.
Thanks very much, Lewis. Just trying to share my screen. Is that okay?
Share the whole presentation. We can see the rest of your screen.
There we go.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to thank you for the introduction, Lewis. We're talking about the implementation of solar PV in the UK. So just to give you a bit of context, we are funded by the NICER programme. And the NICER programme is a UKRI funded programme that's trying to accelerate the interdisciplinary research, innovation and impact to scale up our UK circular economy. And to do that, they've created what's called the CE Hub, which is comprised of 5 centres from textiles, construction minerals, metals, technology metals, which you might have heard of from Met4Tech, and also chemicals, also known as Circular Chem, which is the centre that I'm and Susanna's a part of. Now, what Circular Chem are trying to do is create a circular resource flow of olefins by using a whole systems approach. So we informed from our stakeholder engagement, that knowledge exchange informs our core research themes, which will then culminate into a roadmap which I'm currently developing as well. So who we are, not just the Circular Chem Centre, but we're also part of the Energy Materials Lab, and Susanna's going to present a little bit of work later on in the case study of the Vital Living Lab, and our PI is Libby Gibson. So there's, as you will all know, there's 3 generations of photovoltaic technology. There's kind of the first, which is commercial, mainly silicon PV panels, which everyone's aware of as well. Emerging thin solar cells, which we've just heard a little bit about of, and also the fundamental 3rd generation PV technology, which you can see on the right hand side here, kind of a principal solar cell, which is developed in Newcastle in our labs. You can see from the Angel of the North there, if everyone's aware of that. And that's the kind of structure that we're going to focus on with the case study today. So why are we doing this? We need to move away from fossil-based feedstocks for our energy supply. I think it's around 87% of GHG emissions are from energy production. We also need to create a more resilient supply chain and infrastructure. So we can see from the recent geopolitical crises, such as the Ukraine-Russia war, that reliance on one particular energy source is not resilient infrastructure, and we need the general consensus of an energy mix. So this is just some data I've taken from the national grid for the past year, and we can see that renewables are kind of trying to overtake fossil-based feedstocks for energy output, and solar's contributing just under 5% of that. But we believe solar technology has the ability to give more for the UK, particularly through the uptake of roof installations and increasing kind of the immersion of fundamental technology that can use the materials that we've got in the UK. What are the main barriers that we're starting to see with circular PV? There's significant waste generated in current established solar PV technology. I think there's projected to be about 78 million tons of silicon PV waste by 2050. As Patrick mentioned earlier as well, with the lifetime that we have for current panels, we're going to see a huge influx of silicon PV waste by around 2030 from the lifetimes of current panels. There's a real lack of government strategy for solar PV. So there's, in the British Energy Security Strategy that you can see here, they've said that there's going to be a 5-fold increase in deployment of solar PV by 2035. But actual details of implementation of that is very thin and not really discussed at all. In fact, if you see on the right-hand side there, the latest update for a UK solar PV strategy in terms of a roadmap was about 10 years ago now, so that's 2013. So other things as well, that levers that they can use, such as feed-in tariffs that discontinued in 2019, are a bit of a missed opportunity to utilise a lot of the rooftop spaces we have in the commercial and industrial sectors. So there's government stat suggested there's about 250,000 hectares of south-facing roof space we can take advantage of in the UK. The reliance on the global supply chain as well is an issue when you think about where our extraction and manufacturing really takes place. So about 75% of that is from China. So when you're thinking about that for circular photovoltaics, your circularity is really limited by your supply chain and the resource intensity of that as well. And finally, the biodiversity loss that's associated with mining the raw materials that we've got. So this is just a case study that I've referenced to the bottom right there if you're interested in reading further, but this was work conducted by a member of Newcastle University as well, looking at the erosion of the sandbanks on the Mekong River in Cambodia and the increasing intensity of sand mining that's associated with solar PV panel technology shows that it's just over 7 years' time. You can see that sedimentation's almost completely eroded, which is having catastrophic implications on the people of Cambodia and the biodiversity as well. So it's something that really needs to be thought of in the future. So what solutions are emerging? Recycling of materials and metals is maturing, as the presentations previously has suggested. The UK has adopted the WEEE compliance module that the EU set out, and also using extended producer responsibility, which has its caveats, which Jan has discussed in terms of long-term solutions, but strategies are being developed and in place. Fundamental PV technologies as well can have less reliance on the global supply chain. So the majority of the materials that we source in fundamental PV technologies actually can be sourced within the UK quite easily. And we can redesign solar cells to make them recyclable by design. So what we're really wanting to do here is move away from the kind of cradle to cradle aspect as really move towards a cradle to cradle as opposed to the cradle to grave model that's being implemented mainly today. And also to stress the point that we're trying to introduce a suite of technologies here for solar PV. It's generally agreed that we need a suite of technologies for our energy mix, but I think they can also use solar PV technologies as a suite of technologies, which Susanna is also going to take you through as well with the case study that we've been doing in Vital Lab.
Right, so I'm taking over now. So I'll just present you a case study that we've been recently funded, which is named The Application of Recycled Carbon Black in Printable Electronic and Photovoltaic Devices. We're being funded by the UKRI Circular Economy Hub. And we have two main partners. One is Wastefront, which is a tire recycling company that is setting up a plant in the northeast of England. And the other one is the Royal Air Force. And so briefly what we're doing is that we're trying to achieve circularity in the fabrication and use of emerging PV by ensuring that we don't just go from raw extraction of materials to waste, but we also have incorporation of waste streams into the process. And we manage to get a device reconditioning so that we can close the loop and go from use to refabrication and hopefully keeping it there rather than going into waste. So I wanted to go back a little bit to the barriers that Matt just highlighted a few slides ago, and that we need to really consider before we start any sort of project or any sort of fabrication of a new technology. So one is the reliability and the cost of the supply chain and the device fabrication. And then the second one, as we mentioned, is the generation of waste at the end of life. So for the first one, we need to be aware that we need to be able to choose materials that are widely available, that are not going to cost us too much to get in the event of uncertain times, like, for example, the war that occurred between Russia and the Ukraine. That's going to, increase not only the price of materials coming from overseas, but also the price of energy. And that leads me to the second point. So we need to build something that has a low energy fabrication process, because for the same reason, if we want to diminish our carbon footprint as well, we would like to produce it here in the UK. And to do that, we need to be able to consume as low energy as possible, just in the event that energy prices go up. We also need to consider if we can incorporate waste into our devices rather than just mining directly. And then finally, we also need to choose an inherently recyclable design so that we don't have to worry about how we're going to recycle something at the end of its use without thinking first on whether it was recyclable in the first place. And I wanted to add a last one, and that is the impact, because even if we manage to get to this point where we have a very inherently recyclable technology and we don't generate waste, it's like, can we convince people to use it? Do they know that this exists? So I'm going to tackle all these points in the next slides. And for that, I'm going to start talking about the device technology that we're using. For this case study, we started using a device architecture that is called the triple mesoscopic stack. So basically what we have in here is several layers of different materials, which are the transport layers, so the charge extraction. And then we have let's say the magic layer, where the magic happens, which is the photoactive layer, this is the layer that is going to absorb light and then generate charge. And for this particular case study, we chose halide perovskites, although we could have chosen another technology. We chose them because they're cheap. They're made of widely available materials. We can look here. This is the structure of a perovskite. They are ionic crystals with an ABX3 structure. So you have either iodide, bromide, chloride in the red dots. Then forming a cube, you have normally a metal that is predominantly lead, but it could be tin. And then in the center, you have either organic cations like methyl ammonium, famidinium, or other inorganic elements like cesium, potassium, etc. They have the advantage that they are easily processable at low temperatures, because they can get dissolved in a solvent, and then you can just pretty much create an ink, and then you can print these inks and it dries at 100 degrees. So low energy processing, as we ideally wanted. They have the peculiarity that depending on the elements that you choose to form them, you can change the color, which means you can absorb into different wavelengths. And that allows you to do interesting things, like, for example, getting different colored cells and working with different absorbers as well, so that you can create a tandem, for example. And at the moment, they're the top performing emerging photovoltaic. I think it's at 25.8% of efficiency as per 2021. And this is very, very close to lab scale silicon devices. So let's say the top silicon, I would say, probably stands around 27%. And this is not, the 25.8 is pretty good considering that perovskites were born pretty much like 10 years ago. And then lastly, last but not least in this case, they're inherently recyclable because, well, they're easy to make and easy to break. They can be redissolved into an egg. And now this last easy to make, easy to break, we'll have to think about it as well later on, but I will discuss more about this. Now, on to the second part of the device. So we've talked about the photoactive layer. Now we have to talk about the other layers that I highlighted before that in theory aid charge extraction. And those are also made of cheap and widely available materials. For example, you've got the counter electrode, which is in this case carbon. We've got a spacer, which we use just to prevent the carbon from touching the other side of the cell and creating a short. So in this case, we chose zirconium oxide. The titanium dioxide will help the charge extraction, the electron charge extraction. And then we have another, let's say, electrode, which is a transparent conductive oxide. In our case, is fluorine-doped tin oxide. Now, the fabrication process is very easy to upscale because it's a subsequence of incorporation of layer deposition. So you start with the spray pyrolysis of the compact layer of titania, and then you just build layers and anneal them progressively until you get the full stack. And they are not as low temperature as the perovskite itself, but I think the maximum temperature you will be working with is 500 degrees, which is significantly lower than the standard commercial devices, the fabrication temperature for those. And then in our last step, you just infiltrate the perovskite through, it crystallizes by heating at around 100 degrees. So that makes the process very easy and upscalable to make. But then we've got an extra, which is we can reuse it. Why? If anything out of the perovskite or solar cell is more likely to degrade, that is the perovskite itself. And if we were to remanufacture them, the only thing we need to do is dissolve the degraded layer with some solvents, re-anneal the stack to just like dry it off and remove all sorts of impurities, and it'll be a matter of just re-injecting again. So as you can see in this project, we're considering circularity by design so that we are always able to do this cycle. Eventually, I'm assuming at some point they could break, but they are quite common materials. They could be scraped off the conductive glass surface, crushed and separated, and we could start again. Now, what we're doing in this project is incorporating tires into a solar cell, and you will ask how. Well, first of all, let me talk about the waste stream that we selected. So in this case, we selected tires because we know that around 29 million metric tons of vehicle tires reach the end of the lifespan each year. And if we think of what's happening with them, well, some of them will end up dropped in a landfill, around the 10%. That has a problem, the risk of polluting water streams, just based on the fact that they're just in the outdoors, it rains on them, then toxic elements percolate through the ground and contaminate waste streams. Another option would be to burn them to get energy, but we are releasing like 22 kilograms of CO2 per tire, so that's not ideal, and we're not even getting that much energy because it has a very or a poor energy recovery, is like 33%. Another pathway is the standard recycling. Well, they just get chopped and made into sport pitches, but at the end of the day, if they just get chopped and deposited again on the land, they're still subject to potential contamination or pollution of water streams because it will rain on them and that will percolate. So what our partners at Wastefront have done is that they design a proprietary process that minimizes the waste, the use of CO2, water, and heat. And they produce pretty much two main products. One is liquid fuels for what they have customers in place, and the other one is carbon black. So This carbon black is one of the components of the carbon electrode that we saw in the triple mesoscopic stack before. And that is what made us raise the question, okay, can we use it in photovoltaics? Basically, the answer is yes, and not only we can use it, but we can even improve the system. So basically what we did, we made different pastes using different proportions of, so using virgin carbon black, which is a 20 CV, recycled carbon black, which is the 20 RCB, and the ElcoCarb, which is a benchmark, is a state-of-the-art commercial paste. We build them into solar cells. So we had a reference, number one, that the monolithic would be the full stack that is optimized, and it's purchased from the same company that produces the ElcoCarb. And then the other three, which are also purchased, is up until the zirconium layer, and then we deposited our ElcoCarb paste. And what happened was very interesting. So as you can see, the ones that we deposit the carbon are lower in efficiency because the process was not optimized in our case. We didn't take into consideration thickness. It was a preliminary test, so it means there's room for improvement. But what was interesting is the fact that we got a really high open circuit voltage compared to the, let's say, commercial stack where we just infiltrated perovskite to. And that made us think that indeed, the charge extraction layers are now extracting better. But when I mentioned before the charge extraction layers, what I mean is how do they aid extraction? Well, basically, if you connect a circuit or any load to the solar cell and then you illuminate the perovskite, you're going to be producing electrons that are going to jump from towards the conduction band, and then they get extracted by jumping into the conduction bands on the other materials and then running back and getting re-injected through the carbon. So if we thought of, if we were an electron, for example, and we had to run downstairs as fast as we could, obviously we would run faster if the steps are smaller. So what we think that has happened here is that the recovered carbon black has lowered this step, the valence band of the carbon, and that is what makes the open circuit voltage bigger. And this has to do mainly with impurities. Obviously, we need to keep doing more testing and optimization, but we're proving the point that yes, we can make the perovskites or perovskite solar cells using recovered carbon black. Now, the last point that I wanted to talk about is the impact. So as I said before, even if you manage to get something done, can you convince people to use it? Or can you convince the authorities that this is important? So that's why we also embedded this project or case study into the Vital Living Lab project, which is a project of Newcastle University in collaboration with the Royal Air Force. We have 5 main experiments. We have solar, we have geothermal, LCA and carbon accounting. We have sustainable transport and carbon capture. And basically what we're doing with these experiments, we're trying to help them meet the targets by 2040 to the Royal Air Force to be net zero, but we're working with technologies at TRL level 3 and below, so very emerging. We're just trying to prove a point. And in the case of the solar experiment, what we have is an outdoor testing rig that's designed here at Newcastle University, and we'll be getting live data of our solar cells. So we're going to put them to the test outdoors and see how they perform against all the technologies that is commercial and also all the types of emerging PV. And the point of these is to provide data to decision makers in the MOD and demonstrate that there is potential for using materials recycled in the UK for power generated in the UK that could support and accelerate the UK transition to clean, affordable and secure energy. And also within the same framework of the Vital project, the carbon solar cells case study will also be assessed by our collaborators in terms of life cycle assessment. So comparing using it from the carbon black from virgin sources versus from a more recovered position from the waste tires. Final thoughts. I really wanted to make a first final thought regarding the material, the photoactive material itself, which is halide perovskites. And that's where I'm bringing the point again of easy to make, yes, easy to break too. And the problem with the breaking is what happens with lead. We know that lead is a very toxic metal, it's a heavy metal. And the problem with perovskites, like even though many sources have said, well, perovskites contain much less lead than just the soldering of traditional silicon panels. And while that is correct, the problem is that the source of ionic lead in perovskites is 10 times more bioavailable, which means if it leaks into the ground, there's a 10 times the chance of the plants absorbing it and then ending up in ourselves again. So we have to be careful with these. And that is not to say we need to ditch them, because they're very promising. And there is research going into lead immobilization and like lead capturing before they leak. And because they're inherently recyclable, we could take that lead back and then reformulate them again. So that wouldn't be a problem. But I want to make everyone aware that I'm not coming here with the only solution to our problem. And that brings me to the second point, which I think is also a very important point to consider, is that there is strength in numbers. We don't need to just focus on one type of technology in terms of photovoltaics, and there's space for multiple types of solar cells and applications. We have, for example, dye-sensitized solar cells gaining a lot of strength into the indoor photovoltaic market to power, for example, the Internet of Things sensors. We also have really good combinations of state-of-the-art silicon with, for example, perovskite in tandem operations. So basically what you have is you're able to increase the power output by having two cells in the same space, absorbing into different ranges of the solar spectrum and therefore producing more. Same perovskite with OPV, which is organic photovoltaics. And we also have different applications. We just don't, same as with the Internet of Things and then indoor photovoltaics, we can also think of agrivoltaics, which is, for example, these emergent PV. They are semi-transparent, which means you can put plants underneath. They will still be able to absorb light that will percolate through the perovskite while you're producing power, for example, to just provide, feed a water pump, for example. So that's, if I could summarize the point of circularity, is like, don't rely just on one technology. There is availability of multiple ones. We can do it here. And yeah, I don't know if maybe Matt, you want to add something else to this conclusion?
I think as well, not just the fact that it's a range of technologies, but it's the applications that you can use. So we understand that one technology might not be suitable in a certain scenario, but that's where the power of a suite of technologies comes in. And also pushes it further up the waste hierarchy principle as well. So we're trying to move away from getting through to the dispose aspect. We're actually thinking to create these with well, I think what we're really thinking about is trying to remodulate and redesign by design, aren't we? So we're trying to think of how we recycle this by design.
Exactly, yes. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer.
Thank you very much for that. I think just as a quick first question, how, the two sides of the presentation you've given, so what are the sort of rules for design you might want to include relating to the circular chemistry?
So I think it's a good question. These, in terms of what we see in circular chem specifically as well, is the principles of safe and sustainable by design principles. So we really wanted to push that. You're not just thinking about making something that might perform well that would then be very difficult to recycle and poor for the environment. You're trying to think about how you can design this to make it also easy to recycle as well. Susanna, you got anything on the?
No, I think you've summarized it pretty well. It's just thinking very well before putting something in on the outdoors into the market. And maybe, as I said before, there are great technologies out there. We can think of perovskites as one. Yeah, you can recycle them, but just you have to also consider the toxicity for the environment and how you're going to tackle that before you put it out, so that we don't have to solve a problem in the future without having considered it first.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to hand over to our next speaker now. So following this, we've got Dr. Silvana Olvert from from NREL, and who's going to be talking about evaluating circular pathways for photovoltaics. No worries. Just take your time and get Zoom all sorted. You're still muted, sorry.
There we go. Now we're good.
Excellent.
Okay, let me share my screen. Share screen 2. that's not slide one. There we go, slide one. Am I sharing the right screen?
And no, can't see anything yet.
Oh, why? Oh, there we go. There?
There we go, perfect. Over to you.
Good, great. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Silvana Oviet. I am a researcher at NREL, where I work mostly on bifacial PV and in circular economy. So today we're talking about circular economy work that's been going on at NREL for photovoltaics. I wanted to take a second to look at this diagram that we have on our opening slide, because it represents all of the aspects that we should probably try to aim to improve and consider when thinking about sustainability, right? Circular economy is the name of today's workshop, but it is also a metric that's very focused on mass. And there's some other aspects that are very important for really being sustainable, right? Like the energy and the carbon metrics, which some of the other presenters before me have touched on. Okay. To give you a little bit of a perspective from what's going on the US, right? So right now we are at 100 gigawatts deployed at a 20 gigawatt per year. And we have goals of decarbonizing and doing clean energy by 2050, right? That to achieve this, we need to go from what we are deploying right now, this 20.2 gigawatts per year, out of which we are only making like 4 gigawatts and so in the US. So we want to like increase this and then triple it by 2030. So up to 60 gigawatts, right? So that is a lot of manufacturing and deployment that needs to happen. Now for the world, we also know that we have some very ambitious goals to do the clean energy transition. Right now in the goal in the world, we're at 1 terawatt deployed at 130 gigawatts per year. So how does this look based on the deployments? We have deployments that vary between, let's say, 10 terawatts. If we do whatever the US is doing right now, which the US is about 10% of the world, that is like 16 terawatts. IEA Net Zero had 15 terawatts, and some other authors are now saying, well, we really need 70 terawatts, right? So this is also an increase in the deployment rate of at least 1.5 times up to 23 times what we are producing, deploying, installing, and managing. Added to this challenge of the rapid scale up, right? PV is a technology that's very unique because as an industry, because it has evolved so fast, right? If you look at a module from 5-7 years ago, it already has a very different technology, very different solar cells, as well as package composition, right? We are tending more towards glass modules now, bifacial cells. Every manufacturer is doing bifacial cells in bifacial modules or not, but still bifacial cells. So there's a big change, as well as all of the new areas that are emerging, or new technologies too, right? That are starting to grab some part of the market share that are predicted to grow, like silicon heterojunction or TOPCon. So it has switched a lot from cell and module technology, and it will continue to do so, which poses an extra challenge as we make all of this deployment, right? Because we need new fabrication, new machines, new steps, plus the fact of making more of them. So it is a compounded challenge. Add to this that obviously manufacturing doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have a lot of, at least on the US, policies for manufacturing. Also like in Europe, like I'm learning a lot from the recycling and end-of-life management policies, right? So added to all of this, we need to be smart on how to achieve the deployment so that it is sustainable and actually achievable to us, right? That is why sustainability is an important topic in the PV community, right? We have this goal of the 600 gigawatts per year deployment, and that takes a lot of materials, right? So there are various ways that people have said, this is how we can solve this. We can perhaps make the modules more efficient, right? That is always a goal that we have, to increase our efficiencies. We have talked, maybe we need to make modules more recyclable. Maybe we need to make them more long lasting or less material intensive, right? Lightweighting modules, glass thickness, for example, is predicted to continue to go down, as well as silver. So reducing the material composition and changing it as what we are researching. So all of these are strategies that we can use that follow circular economy concepts, right? Of reducing, reusing, and repairing, etc. However, circular economy is not very well tailored for analyzing PV. Why? Because it doesn't really consider the fact that this is not a toaster. This is a solar panel that is producing energy. And what we wanted to do is to produce energy for as long as possible, right? So as it's not also a cell phone that we want to change every year or every 2 years, right? So to really make a good assessment of the sustainability, you have to go beyond circularity metrics as they are conceived now and think about the energy and the carbon impacts. This is a table of the proposed R's of PV, right? So we keep thinking about refusing, rethinking, reducing, reusing, repair. If you notice, like recycling is down here. This is kind of prioritized on how it should happen. I'm also including here, including here how it looks like for PV. I was looking at one of the links from the previous presentation, and it had a study of what if we reduce PV. I don't really think that that is a good idea because our goal right now is to decarbonize. If you take anything away from this, is like recycling is awesome, circularity, sustainability, making PV green is great, but we really need to decarbonize, right? If we don't decarbonize, the climate change impacts will be much worse than this huge pile of PV modules, which I will get to put into perspective later on the talk. But there is not an option to deploy less PV, maybe, or less renewable energy. The option is to like do it better, do it smarter. All of this paths. And this is the challenge that I saw, right? People keep talking about all of these things that we can do to be more circular. And maybe this is better, maybe this is better. So I really wanted to put numbers into this. So we built at NREL this PV-ICE tool, PV and Circular Economy tool, which is open source. And this is the top view diagram. At its top view is a mass flow, right? So we have installs on one side with all of the characteristics. Then we have the install PV. And then we have various module end-of-life process that we follow. So we degrade the modules as well as have failures and project lifetimes of PV consider. And then we calculate the exit materials as well as the circularity paths in between. And very importantly, the energy entailed on this. So I mentioned circular economy metrics, right? So in general, we're talking about this virgin material extraction, which is very important for producing all of this PV that we need to deploy. And then we have waste. That is circular economy. It's a mass-based metric. For PV, you really need to consider the install capacity, right? And then you also need to consider, okay, the energy that's going into that, right? Some processes that are making the PV are very energy intensive, but you're definitely having an energy payback time in less than 2 years for any technology right now. But we still want to maximize that to be the most sustainable with whatever strategy and module design we decide to go into the future, as well as reduce security of materials, right? If we are struggling all to get that silver, for example, that's not good. Another little shout out to the capabilities of the software that I am presenting the results from. In case you're interested in using it, we can use any deployment forecasts. So that is for a state, for a country, for the world. They are rolling this new forecast of PV deployment really fast. So this is very important, right? To be able to graph the latest 2023 PV deployment. We also have a lot of baselines that are dynamic with time. So most analysis that you see on mass flow take up a module that's just, for example, 70% glass, 20% aluminum, etc. So we are actually have looked historically at the literature and market shares to come up with the module composition and how it's evolving, and looking also at the projections, for example, from ITRPV on how like silver is reducing, etc. So it considers those improvements that are foreseen. Then on the way that we kill modules, we have also improved to consider a little bit more the project lifetime, the degradation, and the reliability of modules. And with this, we have calculated installer capacity, done sensitivity studies, as well as done spatial analysis, because it's pretty good for this if you have the deployment forecasts. So showing you some results on 3 of the main sections. So first of all, first question, circular economy, virgin material, how much do we need and do we have enough, right? So this is for the US. The US needs 75 million tons of virgin material for their goals at 2025. And 75 sounds like a lot, but as always, with everything, you need to put into perspective, right? So in perspective, there is 40 million tons of electronic waste worldwide now. So it is a number, it's a big number. That is the perspective. Okay, let's put it in perspective though of the production of each material, right? For the US, that into 2050, it's actually pretty low what we will need, but we are just one country, right? The real important takeaway is for the world, how much it will need. So it got mentioned earlier in one of the comments, what about silver? Well, according to our predictions, it is which consider the reduction of silver on the different technologies as well, how this new different technologies are going to take different parts of the market share. It is about 40% of the global production. So it is high, definitely. It is definitely high. It is not more than is being produced. But the other thing that I want to invite you all to think about is that mining is also an industry that is improving on itself, right? So years back, we had this panic about what was it? Oil, right? And then new methods fracking appear and it changed. So the capacity is not static to what 2020 got produced. But anyways, it is still a point that we need to be aware of as a community, that there is a high demand of silver. We have looked at this technology specific with our tool, and considering PERC versus TOPCon and silicon heterojunctions, we are incoming and have different demands on the material, right? So as we can see, we still at that kind of 40%, maybe a little bit less depending on which technology and their projections are used. But the one thing that I want you to take away from this is, or that I don't want you to take away from this plot is, you may look at this, say like, well, we should definitely not do silicon heterojunction. We should all go for PERC because silicon heterojunction is using much more silver than PERC, right? So that will be the first approach answer that you may have. But this is, again, just the material story. If we add the energy story, the silicon heterojunction and the TOPCon are producing more energy cumulatively. So this offsets more of the also having less, perhaps, on the production side of the energy, right? So whenever we are doing these assessments, just looking at the mass is not enough. Let's talk about waste. We have mentioned we have a lot of deployment. We have this mountains of waste happening, and that's why we should recycle to also maintain our manufacturing. It is a little bit hard to do a closed loop for PV because we have a lot of deployment here, and the waste is coming very shifted because our lifetimes are pretty long, right? Also, to put this into perspective, so sorry, this is for the US, right, where we have this 1.7 terawatt of deployment. To put into perspective the waste, this mountain of waste, it is, you can actually not see it compared to all of the other waste by 2050. That doesn't mean we shouldn't care about waste. We definitely need to start being proactive about planning to manage it and using it smartly. We don't want to be one of those industries that greenwashes their sustainability, right? We care about the environment, definitely. But currently, and even on the future projections, it is small on scale, okay? But okay, let's say that we do want to reduce waste. We want to. So what is the best strategy? So we evaluated out of this, all of these options of circular paths that we have, as well as, knobs on decision points that we can have in, sure, doing everything will definitely reduce our waste, right? That is the top line. Doing recycling will definitely reduce our waste, but really the main lever for reducing the waste is having reliable modules, right? Not having them die before they're supposed to die, and having them have long life so that they are in the field producing for us. Obviously, they will die later, so they will generate the waste. They will become waste eventually, but it is reducing a lot of unnecessary waste and a lot of the manufacturing waste, which doesn't often get counted too. On lifetime and reliability, we have had increased warranties, right? So going up to 30 years. There's actually one module that now has warranty for like 40 years. So that's really great. Project lifetimes are also gone up on par with that. So we're at like 32 average project lifetime. And you probably have seen this quality or failure reliability plot for PV, right? So we have a high, usually deaths at the beginning from installations or low quality modules that get produced and die on those first couple of years. And then they should be stable in the field. And then we see, and then as a product, as a cohort, they all start malfunctioning or being retired, right? So one of the goals that gets talked about is increasing lifetimes. Maybe like, could you envision a 50-year module life? Like we already have 32. We already have projects that have been on the field a long time producing. So it is not unthinkable to have, once you reach that stability phase, to yes, keep degrading, but keep producing and not failing, right? So lifetime is a very important thing for PV. As we develop new technologies and new approaches to making PV, perovskites or tandems or etc., and we're saying, well, this will have a very high efficiency, yay, but it will only last 10 years or 15 years, right? We should really aim to maintain the lifetime, because we have this target of installing, at least for the US, 1.8 terawatts, right? As the lifetime of the modules fall, that means that we also have to start replacing them. So if we reach our goal and we install that 1.8 terawatt of modules, but those modules are 15-year modules, we're actually going to fall way short from our goal, right? So we're going to end up down here instead of up here, right? So replacement concept plays into circular economy very importantly. And this doesn't always get studied or mentioned on the approaches. Along with lifetime degradation, right? So if you make the modules degrade less fast, like the ones that we're deploying right now at that 30 average lifetime, every 0.1% reduction in degradation saves you around 3 terawatts of replacement for a world scale deployment. So that's another thing that we don't think, like, oh, we want modules to degrade less. Yes, why? Because that translates to having to have this install capacity target. We need less to be there producing or to be there replacing. Okay, cool. So we have goals for installing. We want to install them high quality, but maybe you're just like, well, maybe my technology can be shorter lived and I can recycle it. So we explore that too. Those are the heat maps. Right now we are here on 32 lifetime average, 0% recycling, right? And this amount of virgin demands. If we go down to half the lifetime, we double the virgin demands to maintain that installation goal that we have. And then if we want to offset that by recycling, we have to go up to 85% recycling, okay? So mind you, this is 85% of collecting all the modules and then making the process and the yield and then close looping it at 85%, right? So previous company mentioned that they have 70% PV cycle, 70% efficiency overall in the recycling process. but that is of the modules that they already received. And right now we don't have methods to really capture all that PV that's being removed. Cool. So anyways, final words. Again, we have a lot of more work to present than on this 20 times on the energy balance of the systems and the really metrics that matter, as well as how things like doing perovskites that you can remanufacture, so use the glass and remove the perovskite material, really offset the energy materials. I will not present them, but there's various strategies. We are evaluating them with this tool. I will point you to this paper presented on PBSE. So that is in a couple weeks, and to some of our research. Cool. That is it. Conclusions. We have a tool that can deploy different scenarios, technologies, and uses PV-specific circular paths. And we have used it to calculate virgin materials, waste, sensitivity analysis, and of all of the parameters on the lifetime of a module. We can use this to evaluate novel technologies and identify lifetime of recycling thresholds to meet our decarbonization and material goals. Considering the energy balance is very important to the energy transition. More importantly is the fact that we want to deploy it right the first time and not have to be replacing modules, because that escalates the amount of materials that we need. And there are different strategies going forward, and evaluating them beyond the mass metric is very important. Cool. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So you showed us some areas where we're getting these bottlenecks, but to reach this 600+ gigawatt deployment level, and looking at the whole manufacturing and deployment and all the steps that go into that, are there any other areas that are going to be very badly impacted by scaling? So we heard some of the previous discussions saying, this area of manufacturing might be okay, but are there any other areas you think might be the bottlenecks to scaling that process up?
Well, I mean, that I know right now on manufacturing, silver is foreseen as a critical material, right? We also have polysilicon right now dictating a lot of the module manufacturing capabilities. Like a lot of countries are starting to have their fabs, but they start perhaps not from the very, very beginning, right? From the raw silica, right? So doing that process more widespread on different locations it's currently one of the bottlenecks also that I can think of.
Thank you. There's a question in the Q&A asking for your opinion on repowering is. What this means, whereby utility scale solar farms are reproposing or replacing their solar modules on solar farms after 10 to 15 years and rehousing or moving those panels to other locations. What are your thoughts or opinions on that?
Yes, I am really wanting to study that with our tool. We're waiting for some funding to come with that. What I can say is that what's going on in Europe is very different than what's happening in the US, right? Because we don't have as much land constraints. So there is not that driver to repower here. That's why we're a lot more behind on experiencing really that. There's a lot of noise of this will start happening. We need to prepare for it. But I think someone mentioned it earlier that repowering, who was this? That repowering, it's an option, but it is not if you're really trying to be sustainable, right? You want to install more panels again, because if you're repowering and what you're doing with those other panels, if you're removing them from the generation, you're trying to achieve that goal, you're actually going down. Yeah. Right. So that is the concept. Like, yeah, and yes, if you put them elsewhere, maybe that's good. The economics need to pencil out. And you also need to make sure that it pencils out for this recipient as well. Because sometimes you might think that you're doing a good thing, but then that school where you install them or something will not get as much power, will not get as much time from that. So you might be perpetuating energy injustices. So that's why it needs to be studied a little bit more, at least in the US. And
thank you. And just one final question on your sort of installed versus the effective capacity graph. You know, you had your very high target to try and meet, but even the 50-year lifespan panels, which don't quite meet that target. So what else is missing? What do we need? Do we need even longer lifespan panels or something else to try and get to that goal?
So no, what we need to do is install more, right? To consider that even the 30-year modules, we're going to start seeing modules coming out. So you need to install more, right? So it is when you're reading this type of documents, they're usually talking about how much you're installing, and not really about how much is really producing, right? So that is the difference here, that we're considering the degradation and the failures that happen throughout the life.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for your talk and your presentation. We're going to move on to our final speaker of the afternoon, and Dr. Cara Libby from the Electric Power Research Institute, who's going to be talking to us about advances in PV module recycling. And so, Cara, over to you when you're ready. I can see the whole of your PowerPoint. Everything's good to go. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. So good to be here. I'll probably move quickly over some things that previous speakers have already covered, but I'll be talking about a recent study on advances in PV module recycling and a life cycle inventory assessment for 6 recyclers. And I'd like to acknowledge Karsten Wambach from Wambach Consulting, who prepared this report published last month under contract to EPRI. So at EPRI, I'm a principal technical leader in our environmental aspects of solar group. I wanted to start with a comparison of solar modules and what I believe are called cheese toasties in the UK. In the US, we call them grilled cheese sandwiches. So we've heard a little bit about how these modules are constructed. If you were to envision a cheese toasty, this one has layers of tomato slices in there. We've sprinkled it with basil and oregano seasoning. And when we think about trying to separate out those materials in a way that they have high purity, they are not mixed with impurities, you can imagine the challenge of liberating materials within PV modules. I'll be talking about some innovative processes that promise to make PV modules recycling more affordable and sustainable by recovering more of those valuable materials. Okay, so why do we care about PV module recycling? I think Silvana covered most of this. In the US, these modules could have material value of 15 billion in 2050. For global, you could multiply that by about 10. Similarly, the materials recovered could be used to manufacture new modules, so perhaps 20 billion globally, which offsets demand for virgin materials. We also haven't talked too much about trace hazardous metals. Recycling is one way that those materials could potentially be recovered and managed in a responsible manner. We've heard a lot about solar in a circular economy. I think I'll just emphasize that starting up front with the design of the modules can really prevent a lot of these challenges around recycling, extending the lifetime later. So designing durable, reliable products that don't have toxic materials in them or are constructed in ways that they can be more easily disassembled later could be some of the ways to increase the circularity of solar and minimize waste. Similar to some of the other speakers, EPRI is looking for ways to provide guidance on management options. So PV plant owners, as the waste generators, carry responsibility for module management. And even though there are module warranty provisions, there have been many early losses due to damage or failure that are driving near.
Sorry to interrupt, Cara. Your microphone's sort of coming on and off. I don't know if you just need to bring it a little bit closer, it sort of gets louder and quieter.
Yeah, I'm not sure why that would be. Is
Yeah,
this any
I don't know
better?
either.
If I bring it closer?
I can hear you again now.
So decisions, we heard a little bit about repowering and whether that is something that makes sense to be getting more capacity energy generation for a given parcel of land. Decisions around plant management decisions as well as module management could be influenced by economics, policies and regulations, whether the PV plant owner has certain practices around environmental responsibility or corporate sustainability goals, and availability of services, which has historically been a challenge in the US, and I believe is also a challenge in many other parts of the world. So in the US, we perhaps have more options available than in the EU, where there are regulations in place, but certainly reuse is a common option if modules are still performing well and safe to use. You've heard a little bit about the need for standards to support decision-making about which modules can be safely reused, but this provides an opportunity for revenue or tax savings when those first life modules are taken out of service. Recycling costs for crystalline silicon modules in the US are anecdotally in the $10 to $30 per module range. Landfilling is an order of magnitude lower cost currently at about 50 cents to $1.80 per module. And then if modules are classified as hazardous, they need to be managed as such. And those disposal costs start at around $3.60 per module, but can be much higher depending on the amount of lead or other materials, depending on volumes, other factors. So this is sort of where PV plant owners are facing some of their decisions when it comes to life options for PV modules. We heard a lot about why it's difficult to liberate the modules and recover materials, so I won't spend much time there. Lots of variation in terms of composition, and we heard about how this chart was made in 2020. Crystalline silicon modules are expected to be primarily glass construction, not glass sheet in the next 5 years. So there's been quite a bit of evolution in these breakdowns just in the past few years. So list of barriers to cost-effective recycling. A couple of the other speakers identified some of these as well. So the lack of design for recycling. There's also a lot of variation in bill of materials. So depending on the manufacturer, the module type, when it was produced, and even what factory it was produced in or what line within the factory it was produced in, there can be small variations in the bill of materials. And so when recyclers receive these materials, they might be dealing with 5 or more different glass compositions, for example. And so that can make finding an off-taker for that recovered material more challenging. In the US, we don't have a federal framework to promote recycling or landfill diversion. So that creates some uncertainty around PV recycling. And we heard a little bit about how existing recycling lines are not optimized, and as a consequence, valuable materials like silver and silicon are often not fully recovered. And to improve those recovery rates for those metals may require increased energy consumption or chemical processing. And we also heard that low module volumes currently have made it investment into this space a bit slower. But we're certainly seeing a lot of progress, and we're seeing examples of different mechanical, optical, chemical, and thermal processes at different scales of development and deployment becoming available to process these materials. So in our study, we did a literature search and patent search We observed that there's a trend towards increased interest in PV recycling. Many countries are considering policies on PV waste. And as a consequence, research interest is high, really ticking up around 2010 when there was increased PV growth and also implementation of policies in the EU. Most of these studies are authored by research institutions and universities. First Solar was one of the only companies that was authoring publications. The most publications were from the US, followed by Italy and China. I thought it was interesting that emerging or developing countries such as Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico, India were also publishing, perhaps in anticipation of managing some of these materials. In the patent space, we similarly see increased activity starting roughly 2008 or so. Many of them are targeting recovery of valuable materials or recovery of toxic materials, primarily from commercial PV technologies. And recovery is performed using a variety of approaches: mechanical, chemical, thermal, or some combination of those. We're mostly seeing patents filed in the major markets for PV and where they're produced. And patent owners are predominantly PV producers or suppliers, research institutions. So we repeated a survey of PV recyclers that was initially performed in 2016 timeframe and done in collaboration with NREL in that first survey. At that time in 2016, we identified 25 global recyclers that accept PV modules. And this year we identified 177 recyclers. So certainly growing interest. Just in the United States, we identified 38. I think I've heard of an additional 3 or 4 just in the past couple months that have announced plans. So certainly growing commercial interests in providing PV recycling services. Oh, and in the UK, there are companies captured in that search. So what can we do to drive down the cost of recycling? So this brings us to our life cycle inventory review. And we had 6 recyclers that were willing to provide data and information of their facilities. First Solar is the first, is a major recycler in multiple countries. So 4 recycling facilities with overall capacity of 50,000 tons per year. And we heard from Peter some of the details of that process. So I won't spend much time with that, but recovering over 90% of materials for cadmium telluride technology. Another major recycler in Germany is Reiling Glass Recycling. They are a commercial glass recycler and have 3 plants in Germany that are processing crystalline silicon modules on a batch basis. Last year, they processed about 4,200 tons of PV modules, and they are now constructing a facility that will be customized, dedicated to PV module recycling with 50,000 ton per year capacity.
Hi, Cara, you are dropping out periodically, so I wonder if you might switch your camera off and see if we can get a better bandwidth for you there. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for letting me know. Yeah. Is that any better?
Seems to be for the moment, yes, for fingers crossed.
Okay. Yeah. So with most of these processes, the initial step is to remove the frame and junction box and then perform a crushing or shredding process to reduce the size. And so that's the case for Reiling. This is kind of a benchmark, best available technology in terms of pure mechanical processing of PV modules. You can see that there are quite a few steps to sort and separate out non-ferrous and ferrous metals, additional crushing before screening and further separation steps. And ultimately, they're trying to recover very pure glass. Lux Chemtech is operating 2 recycling facilities in Germany, and they've developed a process that can accommodate a variety of different PV module types, so both crystalline silicon and thin film constructions. They're developing a 1,000 ton per year pilot system, and depending on the technology, it'll use either water jet to separate the backsheet from glass backsheet modules, or light pulse technology for glass construction that softens the encapsulant and allows for glass to be separated from the rest of the laminate intact. They then have a series of chemical steps to increase the purity of the metals and the silicon that's recovered. FlaxRes was mentioned as a startup that has developed a mobile process. They are able to also accommodate both crystalline silicon and different thin film module types using their high intensity light pulse to heat the silicon, which softens the encapsulant and enables delamination. They're currently working with third parties to process the remaining solar cell fragments and recover silver and silicon. Another startup company that was mentioned is Rosie Solar. They're very focused on recovering silicon at high purity. Rosie stands for return of silicon. Some of their work involves a partnership with Sorin and Envy in France. They are using pyrolysis to remove the polymers, and that results in silicon with 5 nines purity, so 99.999% pure silicon. And their new facility will be 3,000 tons per year. They can process both modules that have had the glass removed from their partners, or they can perform pyrolysis on the full modules. And the data for this project is for the full module pyrolysis scenario. And our final recycler is Tialpi. You may be familiar with their predecessor, FRELP, which was funded by the EU about a decade ago. They are operating a 3,000 ton per year pilot plant, and they have a very unique series of thermal processes. First is using infrared lights to heat the full module, then a blade to remove the foils, and then they use liquid nitrogen in a cryogenic process to further separate materials electrostatically. So they're still developing the last couple of chemical process steps. For that reason, we set our boundary for our LCI comparison before those final separation steps. And I'll show that on this summary slide. So it's very difficult to compare the LCI data from these recyclers because they are processing different modules. So the composition is different. Some of them are building their facilities, and so the data they're providing are projections in some cases. So my takeaway here is don't place too much emphasis on the comparison here, but we did set a consistent system boundary at the point where a cell fraction, including the metals, is separated from the glass and polymers. But there are other differences here that make direct comparison not imperfect, I'll say. For recyclers, we looked at where we didn't include the full final separation steps. But I think what we see here is that Reiling is the fairly established mechanical recycler, has set a benchmark in terms of maturity, cost, and low energy consumption. Most of the other recyclers are operating pilot scale facilities using advanced thermal, mechanical, or chemical treatments in an effort to improve recovery. And First Solar, of course, as we've heard, is very experienced in recycling cadmium telluride technology and has a mature process. So I'll wrap up with a few takeaways. We're seeing a lot of interest, growing interest in PV recycling as evidenced in literature, patents, and research and commercial activities. We see many new recycling activities worldwide, but there are still information gaps. We gain experience with some of these innovative approaches. Some of these advances in high value PV recycling that can recover valuable materials like silicon and silver have the potential to increase circularity and provide some of those benefits of reduced mining and other benefits. We were able to obtain LCI data for 6 recyclers across a range of capacities and types of modules that they can process. Mechanical recycling is the current most mature option, but many of these new technologies are showing promise for excellent recycling quality and improved economic value. So we're excited to see this progress just over the span of sort of the 6 years between our initial study and this latest survey of recyclers. I'd be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you very much for that. There was a few technical difficulties with the microphone, but I think we got the main points that you were trying to make through it all. Just a quick question from me towards the end. You know, you were able to compare those things. We understand there's going to be limitations in having to compare different life cycle assessment sources, but what do you think are are there any different technologies within there that seem to be the most promising ways of recycling things, or what's the key benefits we get from comparing the different life cycle methods?
I think we really need to see the economic data alongside the LCI data. Yeah, there's a lot of promising technical work that's been accomplished. I think once some of the either commercial or pilot scale facilities are producing real data, and we can both validate these numbers in the LCI analysis and maybe have some increased understanding of the economics, it'll become more clear if there are winners. But I agree with the previous speaker's perspective that we need all these solutions, and some of these technologies may be better for one class of modules than others, or for one reason or another may be more feasible in some locations than others. So, sorry to dodge the question, but I don't think there are. No,
that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I think there's no other questions that have come through in the Q&A, and just in the interest of time, we've kept people a little bit longer, but I think it was definitely worth the wait and going through this. So I'd like to say thank you to all the presenters, all our speakers this afternoon, and we've had a wide variety of very interesting presentations. Just to clarify with people, the recordings of all of this will be made available and will be posted back up on the Super Solar website in a few days' time, so you'll be able to come back and look through any of the information from presenters. Other than that, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who's speaking. Thank you especially to Dr. Krista Nayland, who's organised all of this and kept us all in line and behind the scenes as well. So if there are no other questions for everyone, I want to say thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.